us in studio the head of policy for the Democratic Alliance, Mathew Cuthbert. We also have our spokesperson on finance, Dr. Mark Burke.
What are ghost workers?
This was a Pirates of the Caribbean reference.
The state, up to date, insisted that it needs to own and control everything. That leads to inefficiency and it leads to corruption and leads to cadres looting while the rest of us are suffering.
What are those sort of key challenges that are holding our economy back from growing? What is it that we need to do from a practical perspective in order for people to see that real tangible change that they can feel that they are able to really take on board? And I think that's really what our turbocharge plan is about.
Well, we're back, and it's great to be back, and I think we have some amazing guests with us here today.
Indeed.
Well, we have with us in studio the head of policy for the Democratic Alliance, Mathew Cuthbert. We also have our spokesperson on finance in Parliament in the National Assembly, Dr. Mark Burke. Welcome, guys.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks so much, Luyolo. Thanks, Kabelo.
So much fun
Lovely
to be
to have
here.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I was saying earlier to Kabelo before we started, have you guys noticed how weird it is when you are speaking about something and then next thing you go on your social media and then it appears? Does that happen to you guys?
All the
Prime
time.
example being Taylor Swift's engagement. I have been stalked by this news, even though I'm not a Swiftie. I think someone mentioned her around me.
There's a phenomenon called the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon, which says that if you speak about something obscure within 24 hours of hearing about this topic the first time, you'll hear about it again.
So
I don't think Taylor is quite that obscure, though.
if anybody was going to come up with a study on the topic, it was going to be Mark.
Yeah.
From like random
Right.
factoid to academic evidence.
I'm a little bit more conspiratorial. I feel like they're listening to us, whether it be your electric vacuum machine, whether it be your tablet, your cell phone.
I'm with Matt.
I really do think there's some merit to that argument. I think they're listening to us.
It's crazy, like I've been seeing it. But, I think, guys, it's so incredible to have you guys. And I think it's so amazing, again, to see young people, because I do think you guys are under 40, you guys are in your 30s. And leading not only just in the Democratic Alliance, but on policy and economic issues in various aspects and positions that you guys are in. And I think that's really amazing. And again, showcasing that the DA does put young talent to the forefront. Yeah. But, whenever we have conversations about the economy, money, finances, policy, I guess people kind of like want to zone out and be like, it's too complex. But the one thing that I do know about you guys is that we're going to break down some real issues and be able to really get to the nitty-gritty of these things. Yeah.
Hopefully I have some fun on the way there too.
And speaking about fun, I mean, for people watching out there, I mean, what can you tell us about yourself? A fun fact that no one knows. You can go first, Mark.
I always shudder at the idea of coming up with one fun thing about myself, but
You can give
he's
us
such a
10
fun
if
guy.
you have them.
I have so many fun things about me. No, that's not the challenge I face. Coming up with any fun at all. An interesting factoid is I spent a large part of my young adult life living in the UK. And at the time I had a friend who was teaching in China. And the most intuitive place for the two of us to meet was in between, which was Russia. And so we ended up doing a 4-day pilgrimage through the forest from Moscow to this cathedral city east of Moscow called Sergev Posad. It was lots of fun, but the standout story from that pilgrimage is on the third day we met some non-English speaking Russians in the hostel we were staying, and they were trying to communicate to us in their broken language that we need to be careful. And we said, what do we need to be careful of? And they just said
and what was that?
Well, I think they're meaning to imply there might be some bears in the forest. So we walked around with quite a bit of fear for the next day and a half.
What I don't understand is, why is this bear not claws? What is this? They don't have horns?
When I go back, I'll work on my Russian and I'll ask them exactly that question.
Okay, to be fair, that was a very fun fact. Matt, it's your turn.
I feel like that's a really hard act to follow, to be honest with you. That was a very interesting story. I was going to give you a simple one-liner on my side, but I think maybe something people don't know about me and which is a relatively fun fact. My work's quite serious. I'm obviously involved in policy, and I think spend much of my day reading academic papers and, making sure that we put out the best research that we possibly can for the party. But I'm a really avid football supporter, and I'm a Manchester City supporter, so you must know that last season was most disappointing, and I'm watching the transfer market very, very closely because I will not have it that Liverpool win the league yet again this year, and they had to wait 20 years for their second title, and I really think that we've got to show up this year, and we need to get the squad that we need in place in order to be able to do so.
Can I just say, you started with Manchester. If you had said Manchester United, this interview would be over. I'm not sitting next to a Man U supporter, but you say...
Are there still Man U
Well,
supporters out there?
I like winning. I like winning, number one. So I don't think that I would. It'd be like voting for the ANC, basically.
Precisely.
Supporting Man United.
For all my sins, I married a Man U supporter.
Shame.
Can you imagine living with one? Ew. Yeah. So let's also get some just general background. Whatever you want to tell us. Where do you come from? How's your journey into politics? Perhaps your family?
Absolutely. Maybe I'll start with the last one first, which is I'm married to a lovely wife who teaches engineering at Stellenbosch University. We met as PhD students in the UK. She's at least twice as smart as I am. I grew up in the Free State, moved to Cape Town, and now consider myself a Cape Townian. And apart from being a perpetual student, I spent the biggest chunk of my working life to date, was about a decade, first in management consulting and then in finance, went from venture capital to starting our own firm. And yes, I stepped into politics last year, still figuring out a lot of stuff, but really enjoying the journey. And
a year into it, are you regretting it yet?
My wife and I sometimes talk about the new challenges that we're now confronted with. When you run your own business, I've heard it described as staring into the abyss and chewing glass, in that you're staring into the abyss because any decision you make could mean the end of your business, and chewing glass because as the founder of your business, you end up with all the problems nobody else is able to solve. And so we don't have those challenges anymore in politics, but of course we're in such a unique and interesting environment now. We've partnered with what used to be our sworn enemies, and there are lots of things for the DA and for MPs to figure out. But I'm enjoying the journey, so I wouldn't describe it as regret at all. I'm grateful for the opportunity, and for however long I'm able to serve my party and my country, I'll happily keep doing that.
Lovely. And Matt?
So I've got a different journey to Mark. I've been a bit of a political animal since early on. So I joined the DA at about 18 years of age. I would have joined earlier if I had a valid branch or constituency in the area in which I grew up in Pretoria. But when I got to university, the gentleman now actually works for our Deputy Minister of Finance in his private office as one of his advisors. I sent him an email in the December to say, I would like to meet you on the first day I possibly can in January to sign up membership for the DA. I've been wanting to join the DA for 2 years, and you better meet me in the cafeteria at the University of Pretoria, otherwise we've got a bit of a problem. And true to his word, he met me there on the 12th of January 2012. And I've never looked back. I finished off my first degree in political science and history. And shortly after graduating, I went to work as a staffer for the party in Gauteng. I furthered my studies some more. Like Mark, I'm also a little bit of a perpetual student. I still don't have my PhD, but I'm getting there one of these days. And following on from being a staff member, I was a local government councillor in the city of Ekurhuleni, where I served for 3 years, focusing on the local economic development portfolio and obviously cutting my political teeth. And then in 2019, the party selected me to go to Parliament at the time at the tender age of 25. Just for everyone, I'm only 31 now, so I've still, despite my relative youth, I'm considered to be a senior. But I started off in 2019 in Parliament, served on the Portfolio Committee on Trade, Industry and Competition, and then in 2023, I was appointed as the party's head of policy. And that's how I found myself here today. And I think sort of my driving motivation has been to solve problems, because ultimately that's what public policy is about. It's about solving problems. And I see the biggest problem in South Africa as unemployment, and the crisis particularly amongst the youth, and the fact that they face a future that lacks opportunity, where they possibly are never going to be able to get a job because of the poor policies of the preceding governments. And I've sort of made it my mission to put together the solutions in order to help people climb up that opportunity ladder so that they are able to live fulfilled lives and ultimately to be able to build a life of meaning.
And a fun fact, since we're doing fun facts, right? As I'm listening to you, Matt, I'm reminded of, I think it was about 12, 13 years ago, where you and I actually spent a night sleeping outside the Department of Higher Education, trying to get things, get the minister at the time, I think it was Kgobisa-Ngcaba, trying to get him to assist students. Do you remember that?
100%. I actually still have the photo on my Facebook, and it's
Luyolo,
Jordan, Yusuf Kasim, and myself, and we're sitting out there against the building with this really nasty green blanket. Like checking over our shoulders to make sure that we don't get robbed during the course of the evening in the middle of Pretoria. But, I think, going back to our shared experience, it was that youth activism that really drove us. Yeah. We didn't quite know what we wanted to do in politics, but we knew we wanted to change things. And, other young people decided to take a different route. We decided to commit ourselves to public service. And, it's tough sometimes in politics, but ultimately it's worth it when you see what you're able to deliver in terms of results and being able to bring meaningful change to people's lives.
Yeah, so I think Mark and I have similar journeys, because I also come from the private sector. Now you've moved from finance in private to our finance spokesperson. Why? What attracted you to that area, and what do you make of the South African landscape? I mean, you've just come in, you've had a year to look over the state of things from the inside, as it were. I find it depressing. What do you make of it?
I'm not depressed at all. I'm more optimistic about our trajectory in South Africa than I've ever been, and I've always been patriotic about the country. Maybe a step back is one of the things you try and do in finance is, I guess some people would call it making bets, but you're sort of trying to figure out what might happen in the future and find a way to monetize that probability. I remember going up to Helen Zille as a bright-eyed, aspiring politician the week before the election date last year. We didn't really know each other that well. And I said to her, are we ready for the negotiations when the ANC gets 39% of the vote? And she said, oh, no, I think they're going to be closer to 45. I said, but are we ready when they're at 39? And I'd been monitoring by-elections, and I'd been monitoring tracking polls and the like. And it seemed to me that we'd get the election outcome that we would get, which is also the anticipation I had when, 10 months prior, I'd applied to join the journey. So I think I came into this hoping for the outcome that we got. And I'm hopeful that those outcomes will keep improving in years ahead. I mean, in the next year or year and a half, we'll have a local government election, which I think will be seismic. And then, 2029 or sooner, we'll have a national election where I think a lot of things will change. And on the way, we are chipping away concessions. So I also look at the budget and some of the things that some of the cadres are doing, and it grates me. At the same time, I've used this analogy a few times, but the DA was able, like Gandalf on a bridge, to say, you shall not pass. And we were able to oppose things that did not sit well with the South African public and did not sit well with the DA. And it is from those, I think RFK described it as sending forth a tiny ripple of hope every time you strike out against injustice. And I think it's from those acts of striking out that the DA is sending forth tiny ripples of hope, and I'm excited about it. This is a journey I'm on. That's why I'm getting up in the morning. And I think South Africans should be, even though things are tough and our economy is stagnating with its growth and there's a lot of unemployment, I think democracy is working as it should. People are getting punished for under-delivering and over-promising. And I think we as a party and South Africans as a country stand to benefit from this change.
Yeah.
So, just speaking on that, I feel the feeling also on the ground, Matt, I don't know how you think about it, but particularly for a young person, right, where you kind of ticking the boxes of what you should be doing. You go to primary school, high school. If you're lucky enough, you further your education and you get a qualification. So you're ticking all the boxes of what it means to actually make it in this economy, make it in South Africa. But then at the end, you're sort of disappointed about the type of democracy that we have and, the economy that we have, because you've done everything right, but yet you're still failed at the end. And that feeling is, I think most people are starting to feel it more and more and more. And so, Matt, when you're looking at just the policy environment that we find ourselves in as a country, because many of us at times we can't really pick and choose and say, well, it's because of this particular policy implementation that this is the result. But we know that something is wrong. We can feel something is wrong in our country. But what's your thoughts on that?
So I think it's a very difficult place to be in as a young person in South Africa. And I think, up until this point, and we would have seen with election turnout during last year, that young people have felt really apathetic about the situation. They feel helpless. They feel as if no matter which party they vote for, things are not going to be able to change. And I think there was a large psychological barrier that needed to be broken there. And I think what the DA effectively was able to do last year was to break that psychological barrier. And the reason I say this is that people like to back a winning horse. So people voted for the ANC time and time again because it was a comfortable option. They knew that they would come ahead and ultimately there would be no one to compete with them. But we then saw the election result that we did, and as Mark referred to, they came in at 39%, which I think was a big dip for them to take at a national level, and ultimately showed that they were able to be defeated. We then saw, as we moved towards the budget, that despite them trying to do things by sort of executive fiat or, dictating to the rest of the parties, we were effectively able to oppose them. And I think from that perspective, it was once again important for South Africans to see that the ANC did not hold the monopoly on thought within the GNU itself and within government, and that things could change. And what I think is slowly starting to build up as we move towards next year's local government election is that people see that the ANC are really weak. And they see that if they strengthen the hand of parties like the DA, they are able to bring about change. Because we just look at the amount that we've been able to do in the -6 ministries that we do have, where we don't hold the economic levers of power. And yet we've been able to deliver reform, we've been able to root out corruption, and ultimately we've slowly been able to shift the needle. Whilst there's still a hell of a lot that needs to be done, it shows that change is in fact possible. And what young people need to do as we get closer towards the local government election is to strengthen the DA's hand so that we are able to take control of more municipalities, of more departments, and ultimately able to implement our policies to uplift South Africans. And I think that's what's really, really important. I think from a policy perspective, and this gets to really the topic of what we want to discuss today, is what are those sort of key challenges that are holding our economy back from growing, furthering prosperity for South Africans, in particular young South Africans, and particularly, what is it that we need to do from a practical perspective in order for people to see that real tangible change that they can feel that they are able to really take on board? And I think that's really what our turbocharge plan is about.
Yeah, so I guess the question from that, Matt, so we had the seismic election, and then we had the series of victories, not just getting rid of VAT. We saw Ngcaba pushed out. We saw Mkhunu. I don't even know what to say. Is he out? Is he in? He's
chilling.
He's like a substitute, to use a football metaphor. He's a substitute.
Exactly.
He's playing in the reserves at the moment. Yeah.
Still getting paid, though.
Yeah.
Exactly, lucratively. So, but following all of those wins, I suppose it makes sense that the DA came out then with this plan, and we saw John speaking about it, sort of just breaking it down for the country, what we want to achieve with this plan. Why do you think now is the appropriate time for that message? What are we trying to get across to people? Because we still got quite a way from 2029 and a position when we would be able to give effect to this in full. So tell me a little bit about the timing of this plan.
So I think there's a couple of things here, and it's important in the context of, number one, the sort of year anniversary of the GNU. We've been in the GNU for a year. As I said, in our respective ministries, we've tried our best to implement reforms to bring about credible change. But it's not been enough to get the economy to a point where it's growing and where we are creating enough jobs to make sure that we are shifting all of the economic indicators in the right direction. We sit with annualized GDP growth of 0.6%. You would have seen the recent employment statistics. They are north of 33% if you just use the standard definition, which doesn't even include discouraged work seekers. And as the DA, we found that fundamentally unacceptable. And there are key levers within a number of ANC ministers' portfolios which they have failed to pull, which we need to address from a structural level so that we are able to grow our economy, we are able to bring more people into jobs and ultimately create a more prosperous South Africa. And that's really why it was important for us to land this specific message now. We also then have a very clear binary in front of us. We have the DA who's saying these are the widely recognized solutions that need to be implemented in order to change the trajectory of the country. And then you've got and the estimates vary from 450 million rand to 700 million rand in the form of a national monologue, which the ANC are trying to use as a way to recapture society and reroute themselves in various constituencies, whether that be civil society organizations, religious institutions, and the like. But we would have seen at the first national convention the farce that it is. It is ultimately the ANC going out there trying to apologize for all of the missteps that they've made whilst they've made themselves richer at the expense of the vast majority of South Africans. And I think that it's very clear, at least in voters' minds, that we can talk, we can call a council, we can call a commission, we can kick the can further down the road, or we can say, we're done with talking, we want action. And that's why it's important for the DA to go ahead with its plan to turbocharge the economy so that we can change things around. Now, it's fine.
Just one thing, sorry. We always talk about GDP.
Yes.
And for the benefit of our listeners as well, can you just maybe break that down further so that we just have an understanding? Because I think in most discussions about the economy, we hear this word. It's said a lot. And, what does it mean? And can you just break that down for us just to grab it as well?
Sure. So GDP is gross domestic product, and it's basically the amount that the economy grows by a percentage each and every year, right?
Yeah.
So ultimately what you would like is you want the economy to grow more than the population grows on an annual basis, so that the resources that are collected then by the state and then distributed throughout to the people through services and infrastructure and the like are able to meet the needs, right? But we found ourselves in a situation where our population over the past couple of years has grown by approximately 1.1%.
Sure.
But GDP is only growing at 0.6%, which means that the pace at which our economy is growing does not keep up with the birth rate that we have in our country. And fundamentally, over time, our GDP per capita, so that's basically when you take the entire country's GDP and you divide it by the population, has declined on average for 13 years in a row, which means that South Africans have become fundamentally poorer over 13 years. And that's a really, really, really dire statistic for us to look at. And that's in a practical sense what it is that GDP is. Maybe Mark's got something to add to that.
I would say that, what GDP sometimes hides as well is that South Africa is also a very unequal country. And once inequality takes hold in a society, it's shown over time to expand, meaning the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So if our GDP is contracting or staying stagnant, which it has for the last decade, and our population is growing, but inequality is also growing, then what you're really seeing is that poor people are really suffering more year on year. Now, back to your question earlier, Luyolo, you've got young people who show up at a bank and say, I'd really like to work here. What do I need to do? And they say, well, you got to go study to be a chartered accountant. We really need some accountants. And so they go study for 4 years on a bursary and with great difficulty, making lots of sacrifices on the way. And they show up again and they say, what do I need to do now? So, oh no, you need to go to a auditing firm or an accounting firm and do 2 years of articles, and then they do that and they show up again and say, what do I need to do now? And then say, well, we only really hire people with 5 years experience across industries. And so it seems to young people that the goalposts keep getting shifted. It seems to them that really what's happening to them is they're getting poorer year on year. The ability to improve their circumstances is the barrier just keeps getting bigger, and I think South Africans are hella resilient. There's an old struggle song that said, the higher you build your barriers, the taller I become, and the further you take my rights away, the faster I will run. But sometimes we say in South Africa that people are resilient, and what we really mean is they should do more with less.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's okay. So these GDP numbers are scary, but it's also the reality for people in my peer group that they're just not feeling like they're getting ahead. And then the most talented ones are getting on a plane and carving out a life for themselves elsewhere.
Yeah, so I think to make the country work for young people, for people who need to get a foot in the door of the economy, what should our GDP be? And can you also give some comparators? Like, if you say it should be 4%, is it asking for the impossible? What are our peers doing around the world? Just so our viewers and our listeners actually have a picture of how far behind we are falling.
Sure. So I think that at a bare minimum, we need to be growing above the population growth rate, right? But I think a realistic expectation is to try and move ourselves as close towards 2.53%, in the short to medium term, right? With the view of trying to get that closer to 5 over time. I could say to you today, we need to chase 8% growth, but I do think that that's unrealistic considering the context within which we find ourselves. If we look at a number of emerging market economies, and let's use a comparator, where we have Javier Milei, and yes, there's some questionable things that the man does and says.
That's Argentina, right?
Fundamentally, yes, in Argentina, fundamentally through the reforms, and when I mean reforms on a massive scale over a period of just over a year, he's been able to get his country to grow in excess of 5%. And I think that that's really testament to political will and applying the necessary urgency to address the economic problems that your country faces. And there's nothing stopping from South Africa moving on a similar trajectory, but then we need to implement those reforms in order to be able to grow our economy and ultimately to be able to create jobs.
And just quickly, I just to break it down even further, when we are sitting at that 2.53%, how does it feel like on the ground? How does it look like on the ground? Because, yes, we're talking about the economy and, how GDP affects it. But for the ordinary South African who goes to the store, goes to the shop, sees that, food is more expensive. What you used to get with 800 Rand, to feed your family is now much less. So how does it look like? Just to really put it in perspective, when you say 13 years in a row we've declined in our GDP, what is that impact on a normal, ordinary South African person?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And I think it's also important to bring Mark in here because I think Mark has a good view on this. But I think most simply it's about having that little bit more purchasing power every month. It's about saying, okay, I can go to business and I know that I've, done the hard work of getting my education, building up my skill set, and there's actually an ability for me to be able to get a job. It means that we have a more prosperous society where ultimately the hard work that you put in results in something tangible that you can take home to your family. And I think that's what it looks like to the person on the ground. Mark, what do you think?
Absolutely. I think there's almost two answers to that question, Luyolo. The one is, how does it look? And the other is, how do we get there? And maybe through the course of today, we can chat a bit about some of the reforms that are needed. I mean, we mentioned Argentina. One of the things they did out there, regardless of what ideology you subscribe to, they said, for every new regulation introduced, meaning how businesses should operate or organizations within that country, two regulations of equal stature needs to be stripped away. So you can only introduce a new purpose-fit regulation in 2025 if you come up with two existing pieces of regulation that no longer apply and shouldn't be there anymore. The difficulty we have in South Africa is compliance has become, in the minds of some people, and I'm looking at the ANC when I say that.
Side eye ANC.
Side eyes to the ANC. It's compliance has become an employment driver, meaning you've got people sitting in organizations enforcing the rules on other people. Nonsensical rules that hold things back. And so you've got two costs there. You've got the taxpayer funding this compliance job that does nothing but wrap other people over the knuckles for doing things that aren't actually damaging to society. It's just written on a piece of paper that you're not allowed to do that thing. And somebody wrote that on a piece of paper in 1960. Yeah. So on the one side, there's a cost to those employees, but the other cost is to the economy of the inefficiency that results from the sprawling bureaucracy that exists because we think of compliance as some sort of a job creator. Yep. The jobs you want to be creating are things that produce so that you can ship to the rest of the world and that you can efficiently deliver things to your local market. And so once we start implementing the reforms, our 6-point plan, our production will become a lot more efficient. And this almost low-grade war over resources that's happening at the moment. There's about 1.3 million state employees. These are people that are well paid, actually above market, and some of them are good people doing good work. I'm thinking of teachers, doctors, and nurses. But a lot of them are sitting in positions where they're getting compensation unrelated to what they would have been able to earn in the private sector. And they're almost at war with the unemployed because they would do anything to protect that job, including holding back people starting their own organizations. Sure. And this is a result of sprawling bureaucracy, which we need to chip away at, and which is why the DA is proposing a 6-point plan, but also why, as a party, for decades, we've been advocating for the private sector to be creating opportunity, not for the state. The state should be an enabler of opportunity, not the creator of opportunity, not the provider of opportunity.
And what is interesting about that is you were just talking about how in Argentina, for every one new regulation, you have to get rid of 2. We are doing the exact opposite, and if it's possible to do it bigger and worse. Like, think about, we've introduced the Expropriation Act now, and it's got ripple effects in our relationship with the United States. So they're peeling back, making it easier to do business. We are making it harder and antagonizing our trading partners. The cost of those sorts of ideological projects, and I don't know what else to call it, is the reason for all of this just ideology? What does it come down to?
I'm a bit more cynical of that. So again, I'm optimistic about South Africa, but I don't think this is even ideologically driven anymore. It's opportunity driven. It's the cadres benefiting from these silly policies. We'll touch on, I'm sure, many, but BEE being one example. One study is indicating that up to R1 trillion has circulated between 100 connected individuals. Why would you perpetuate a policy that benefits less than 100 people at the expense of the whole of the South African population, if not for private interest and private gain?
So what's funny is I've been pondering a lot whether or not to share a personal anecdote.
Please do.
But interestingly, when I grew up, my dad was a beneficiary of BEE, started his own company, manufacturing business, I think 50 employees. What happened was then the ANC came calling because they've got this idea that if you're a black person who built a business, you did it thanks to them. They made you, right? So the cadres came calling and demanded that he give 30% of his business equity to a cadre. When he refused, he was then refused IDC loans. They sicked SARS on him in the Tom Moyane era. Government contracts lost. So my childhood changed overnight. And I agree with you entirely. I think it's actually an extractive network. Yep. All BEE is. It was never intended to be broad-based. It was just to extract, and then the cadres can come in and grab their piece. Now, the question becomes, is it even feasible to dismantle that with the ANC still in power? What is a real way to address that extractive system?
I see Matt jumping at the bit.
I want to take one step back and just look at the original nature of the problem, right? And the policy which has made ANC cadres rich and locked the vast majority of South Africans who are black out of opportunity. And I think the ANC like to sell the policy of BEE or the law of BEE as somehow a universal good. But there's no mention of BEE in the Freedom Charter. There's no mention of BEE in any kind of ANC documentation in the 1980s. And it's important to get to the origin of how this policy was in fact conceived. And fundamentally what BEE was and what it was designed to do was for certain segments of the status quo, big business at the time, to be able to stabilize the environment and to be able to continue the access that they had to government as well as the market by buying off, in essence, a number of politically connected cadres. And that's why we've seen so many ANC politicians, I think our president is a good example of that as well,
Yes.
who became a multi-millionaire, without billionaire,
Yes.
pardon me,
In South
billionaire
African terms.
in South African terms, yes, not dollar terms, but a multi-billionaire by never having to actually invest in his own business and actually have to build the business
Yeah.
up. And I think this is the most stark example of exactly how perverse the system has become. And people have now seen over a period of almost 30 years that despite what the ANC have said in terms of defending BEE and saying, well, the opportunity is coming to a place near you, that benefit has never ever trickled down.
It never gets to people.
It never gets to people on the ground. And that's fundamentally the problem with BEE. Yes, we come from a very painful past. We need to redress the legacies of the discriminatory policies that were put in place by the previous regime. There is no doubt about that. And the DA is firmly committed towards redress. But it's about the how.
Yes.
And what is it that we do in order to uplift people so that you don't sit with the situation where politically connected individuals benefit whilst the vast majority of South Africans on the ground continue to languish in poverty.
Yeah, exactly. I think for people to understand how pernicious BEE is, as Matt has now described, what happened is not ideologically aligned. And we should also, by the way, touch on these other pernicious pieces of legislation and regulation, such as the Expropriation Act. But BEE was effectively conceived by Anglo. Now, to just take a step back, during the dark days of apartheid, we were isolated as a country, and the government responded by imposing capital controls. And so it was very difficult for any individual organization, but especially large multinational organizations, to externalize capital, which is effectively sending a wire instruction to move your money from South Africa to New York. And so what these organizations did during those years is they would reinvest capital locally. Anglo especially ended up buying a lot of businesses, the crumbs, if you will, in South Africa. But then was looking for a way to externalize that capital at the dawn of democracy. And so what they ended up doing is they said, well, we will conceive of this policy called Black Economic Empowerment, where we will extend shares to previously disadvantaged groups, but politically connected individuals, it turns out. But we won't just give them the shares. We will give them the promise of the share on the basis of the future cash flow of our local operation. So just to unpack that a bit for people, it says you will earn the right to buy shares from us from the proceeds of our local operations over the next 10 or 20 years. And so it'll look like you get 30% of the business, but really you'll get 8% of the business. And if we make money in the future, you can repay the loan that we advance you now to buy these shares from us. And then you would turn around and say, well, who's going to finance that? And so in the first sort of landmark deal, that was the pilot project, if you will, of BEE after Anglo had conceived of it, was a Sanlam deal, which was funded by the IDC. And so the IDC allowed, effectively with local capital, the funding of this transaction. It was the sale of Metropolitan at that point. Within Sanlam. And so here we end up with a position where the so-called beneficiaries are taking out loans on future cash flow of local operations so that large multinationals could extract their capital over time from the country. Does that sound like something that's positive?
That has anything to do with people on the ground.
At any point, right? And so
Stitch up.
it's an absolute stitch up, and it's so wild that people in 2025 are still defending this.
But Mark, just to maybe latch on to what you're saying, because I think a lot of the time, and I think many of us will sit in different circles, right? Particularly on my side, where, once you speak about BEE or the scrapping of BEE, it's like, well, there's the DA is against transformation. The DA doesn't want to recognize the historical, our historical past, right? And so I think phrasing it from the perspective of South Africans who have completely been left out of the economy, who are fighting for scraps, and are sort of hearing this message that the DA is saying, let's scrap BEE. It's and I don't want us to shy away from this, right? I need us to break it down all the way, because BEE has destroyed our economy. But the messaging and how it sounds when we say scrap BEE to those who are fighting for the scraps on the ground is not coming across. And I want maybe you guys to just break it down thoroughly, of that impact to that person who's saying, well, I have nothing, but now you want to take another thing away, even though I don't understand what it is, but like you're taking something else. And I want us to not shy away from that and go deeper into it.
Yeah, I think it's a super valid question to ask. And I just want to empathize with people who already feel, as I said earlier, so constrained and are constantly being asked to be more resilient. If my good word is anything to go on, taking away BEE will not impact South Africans at all. It will make their lives better immediately. Let me unpack that a bit. The study that I mentioned earlier by Professor William Gumede that indicated R1 trillion between 100 connected individuals. Mm-hmm. If instead of spending that money between those individuals over the last 31 years, we decided to give small business development grants, or startup grants, if you will, of 50,000 Rand each. So a grant of 50,000 Rand to 20 million people is what we could have done. That's effectively the adult population of South Africa. Would have each been able to qualify and receive a small business development or startup grant. And wouldn't that have been so much more powerful for the economy than the money circulating between these individuals? Now, of course, that money's already spent and it has been extracted by this Kgobisa network. But we have to start conceiving of what we will do. But there's another benefit that will accrue to the people that would ask you this question, Luyolo, is when somebody now looks at South Africa, at the same time that they're looking at Botswana and maybe Brazil and Turkey, they would say, at the moment, as soon as I show up with a sizable amount of money to try and build a factory or, get a local fintech bank going, or whatever your niche is that you're focused on, I don't have to now part with a third of my capital at the point where it enters the country because I have to comply with some silly stitch-up policy by big business and the ANC elite. I can in fact know that I will deploy the capital and I'll be able to, over time, generate a profit while I'm creating opportunity for people locally. That's called an efficient investment opportunity for external investors. And we need to get something called our gross fixed capital formation in South Africa, which is effectively how much money is being spent on building things for the future. We need to get that up from a rate of 15 to 25% if we're going to be able to reduce our unemployment from the shocking numbers we shared earlier, and for our economy to start growing again at 4 or 5%, which, by the way, did happen under the Mbeki years, is possible. And so we need to start creating opportunity in South Africa. And the way you do that is by not scaring off people who want to come here and want to participate in this economy. And that, unfortunately, is happening at the moment. So the fact is, had this policy not existed, and had we conceived of an alternative, there would have been a lot more money in the pockets of South Africans trying to start their own ventures. And even now, while all of that has happened, we need to proactively think of how we make it very attractive for people to come here and to participate in this economy, and for existing businesses who are already in this economy to not have another compliance burden that they need to adhere to just to get the thing off the ground. I mean, the amount of stuff you need to keep in mind when you're starting a venture. I wouldn't blame anybody for saying I way rather would want a corporate career if I can get one than starting my own venture. But really what you want as a society is for people to say, no, it's more exciting for me to start a venture because it's in small and medium-sized enterprises that we create employment. Large enterprises sustain employment. But if you want to create employment, that has to come from emerging businesses, not from established businesses.
100% agree. And I think what's so disheartening about the ANC's perspective on these things is, notwithstanding what we can all see looking at the past 30 years, instead of rolling back, they're doubling down. So now we've got, is it 100 billion rand, the transformation fund?
Yeah.
And I can't see that it's going to do anything except just make the same situation worse. It's going to replicate and perpetuate the system. So Matt, I just want to ask you, because at some point I want to talk about some of the other ways that we're making it hard to start businesses. For example, our energy situation. But do you have any sort of other thoughts on what we need to do to end the job-killing impact of the race-based policies?
Sure. So I think from a BEE perspective, we've set out exactly what the challenges are, right? Ultimately, communities don't feel the impact that these policies purport to have and have for the last 30 years. And it's not about saying, well, we scrap BE and that's it. It's about saying, well, what do we do as an alternative as a party, and how do we bring about real empowerment in communities that have been left out? And what we are working on as a party and as myself as an individual is a private members bill that we are going to be introducing, which deals specifically with public procurement. So it's called the Public Procurement Amendment Act. And this focuses on ensuring that you don't end up with situations like you did at Kgobisa Hospital, where they are paying 500,000 rand for skinny jeans, by way of example. And you focus on value for money procurement, because often you have to have a certain BEE grading in order to be able to do business with the state. And the state is obviously a large contributor towards business opportunity within, or shall I say, for businesses within the country. But you're immediately blocked from doing that because you aren't necessarily at the relevant BEE grading level. So what we are focusing on is, instead of focusing on race as a proxy for disadvantage, we look at poverty for a disadvantage. So you as a business who wants to go out and do business with the state need to focus firstly on the value for money that you are going to generate out of that contract. Is it the cheapest possible that it can be when you procure that good, when they procure, the government procures that good from you as a business? Are you financially compliant? Are you, tax compliant? Are you making sure that you don't have any outstanding judgments against your name, right? And then we focus on what we call social impact, right, and economic inclusion. And this looks at the real economic empowerment elements of this, right? So if you are wanting to go and invest in a specific town and you are running an agricultural business, let's say, by way of example, what are you doing to benefit the community around you? Have you set up a feeding scheme to help those who find themselves in poverty? Are you building those businesses into your value chain? What are you doing to actually contribute back to the society in which you operate on? And I think we've faced a lot of criticism as a party for this, is around our alternative model, and because people don't quite understand what it is, right? And it focuses on what we call the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And these are, laudable things such as no poverty, zero hunger, decent work and economic growth, ensuring that we have safe communities and that the rule of law is in fact established. And there's about 17 of them, right? But to break away all of the fluff is to focus on what these real things are that can be done on the ground. And we believe that our alternative as a party, which really focuses the impact in which businesses in the communities in which they operate are able to give back to those communities. Number one, we're not going to be paying 500,000 rand for skinny jeans or 200,000 rand for 10 mops, but we are going to be focusing on getting value for money services. And at the same time, businesses who engage in business with the state are going to actually contribute back to the community communities in which they operate in. And I think that's really important as our alternative.
No, Matt, just to and also Mark, just to bring you in on that, I think there's something very important that you're saying about, when we talk about race as a proxy of disadvantage, we also need to look at what has been happening in our country, right? I mean, we've seen the Kgobisa scandal that has broken out where, those companies that he owned kept on receiving tenders over and over and over and over again. And so the ANC policy to use race as a proxy for disadvantaged has continuously benefited those at the higher echelons of power, right? Mm-hmm. And so the people that I'm speaking of, who are fighting for scraps are not in those higher elements. And so I think when you say, and I just want to make it clear, when you say that poverty as a proxy of disadvantaged, you are saying that we separate those who have already benefited from the system, which essentially your Kgobisa and many others who have continually looted the state.
They've eaten.
And we are focusing on those who truly are disadvantaged, who are living in poverty. And I want us to make the connection of that individual who's saying, BE is another thing being taken away to the proxy of poverty is actually you. We're talking about you here.
So I think there's a really important point to make here, right? Despite BEE policy, the black unemployment rate is the highest, right? The most poverty-stricken segment of our population are black South Africans, right? So this policy would target those who find themselves most in poverty, who by vast majority happen to be black. But at the same time, we wouldn't be excluding any other grouping from empowerment. Yeah. And I think that's the important point to make here as our alternative, is to say we're not excluding anyone, but we're focusing on those individuals who actually find themselves in a true state of disadvantage. Because can you say, when you've been granted 5 different IDC loans or National Empowerment Fund loans, that you are in fact at disadvantage? I don't think that that's the truth.
I want to disagree with you in the sense that we're not excluding anyone, but to clarify, we're excluding the greedy idiots who don't deserve any more help. It's a point that...
Agreed.
I feel your frustration.
Agreed.
I had this discussion with Helen, and the point she was making was you can't run away from the reality of South Africa's history. So if you say you're going to focus on poor people, they are overwhelmingly going to be black. So if you are that woman in Khayelitsha, nothing changes for you. You're still able to get into the system and compete, etc. We're just going to remove the Kgobisas who are going to bribe their way to get ahead of you in the queue. We are removing some people. It's just not you, the ordinary poor person. You're not the person we're trying to exclude.
100%.
The best way to put this, Kabelo, is that BEE, as it's currently being implemented, is the equivalent of a Virgin Collection, Alice Lane, or Slow Lounge, or an elite golf club cosplaying to be a community library. It is not accessible to the average South African. It is hyper elite. You need to be really wealthy and connected to get into some of these places, such as a golf club. And to pretend that it's open to the public and it's benefiting the public is a blatant ANC lie, which has to be countered. The fact is, we're trying to build a community library here of opportunity where people can walk in and say, these are my circumstances, this is what I've got to offer, what is at the state's disposal to try and help me create an environment for opportunity. And I think we do need to counter this narrative that when we come up with a poverty-based measure to try and uplift people, that will somehow take something away from people who need it the most. What it'll take away is these non-founder, business-adjacent billionaires who happen to have benefited from a stitch-up policy conceived by people who wanted to maintain capitalism as apartheid went away. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not opposed to capitalism, but when it has to happen in secret, when it has to happen in a smoky, wood-paneled room which none of us can see, then we should start asking some questions of who's benefiting and why are they so vehemently protecting it?
Oh, bamong. Anyway, that's just...
So people can drink tears of Caesar, you know?
Yeah. But guys, honestly, you know, we have a 6-point plan. The DA has a 6-point plan. And John Steenhuisen, the leader of the DA, made this announcement of how we are going to turbocharge our economy. And, you know, we're speaking about these issues, and I think, you know, most South Africans, even if they're not thinking about them in detail, do feel them, do experience them in a daily basis. But what is the plan? What now? What is the DA saying? How are we going to turn the situation around?
So I think the first thing, and we've discussed a lot of it this morning, is removing those roadblocks towards growth, right? Because the ANC and their policies have acted as a handbrake on growth over the last 30 years. Yes, we had a period under Mbeki where it grew, but our unemployment numbers weren't able to keep up, right? Because it wasn't labor absorptive growth. And fundamentally, that is what we are trying to achieve as the DA. So it's about removing those roadblocks, scrapping BE and replacing it with a true empowerment alternative, right? Other problematic legislation, like the Expropriation Act, for example, which dictates that in certain instances, nil compensation can be provided for. We've got a perfectly good framing within the Constitution which speaks to just and equitable compensation, which should be underlined by market value. And that is what we believe that particular piece of legislation should be amended to in order to make sure that we don't undermine property rights and we don't continue to deter investment from landing on our shores. And then we also focus on other pernicious pieces of legislation, such as the employment equity legislation, which in effect, when the most recent regulations were issued, basically means that if you are a coloured South African in the Western Cape or you're an Indian South African in KZN, because of the strict and harsh racial quotas that the state wants to impose, it's very likely that you're not going to be able to get a job because they'll say, okay, sorry, we've reached our quota of coloured or Indian South Africans, and therefore we are not able to hire you.
Can I jump in, Matt? I think a lot of South Africans, if you're not in the political arena, BEE, employment equity, these things all sort of meld in together. Am I correct to make the distinction that BEE deals with sort of business ownership, whereas employment equity is for jobs? So we also do need to sort of not only look at how BEE deters investment, etc., but actually, even if you had the investment, what happens with employment and that sphere? I know that our president passed the Employment Equity Amendment Act, and then we had the regulations to that, which give you race quotas to the decimal point. So you would need to hire 11.78% coloured people. What does that actually do to job opportunities?
Well, it decimates job opportunities, quite simply put. And I want to give you an even more ridiculous example. So the most recent regulations, which the DA is challenging in court, in effect say that each and every person must identify as a particular race group within a business as a part of the employees in that particular organization. And if that person does not identify as a specific race group, then you need to use evidence in order to determine what race group that person is so that you are able to calculate your 11.78%, for example. And I mean, this is like apartheid-style pencil test stuff. Like it really is.
It's outrageous.
It's absolutely outrageous. And ultimately, once again, it is another layer of bureaucracy that you add specifically for foreign businesses that want to come and invest in South Africa, grow our economy, create jobs, for them to say, okay, well, you know, you have to choose from this specific pool of individuals. You have to have X amount of this particular race group, X, Y of this particular race group, Z of this particular race group. So you're adding all of these regulations on top instead of making sure that you focus on making it as easy as possible for people to invest, number one, and number two, that you don't put in place these social engineering policies such as employment equity, which actually end up in worse outcomes for the people that they purport to try and protect and uplift.
So, Mark, I wanted us to also just move to the other point on the turbocharge plan, which is energy, right? And I think, some of us, I guess most of us as South Africans are like, well, we haven't really had load shedding, so maybe things are kind of okay. But John in his press briefing also mentioned that we have a plan around energy, and I think any South African out there that doesn't think there is a problem is really misled. We have a huge problem with energy.
Yeah, it's always a tricky subject to convey simply, but if I had to put it in one sentence, it's that we are massively overpaying per kilowatt hour of electricity. So you've got almost two challenges there. The one is it's super expensive, and the second is it's still unreliable. What has happened over the last couple of years is, as often happens with the resilience of Africans, is they've stepped into the void. So we've seen a massive uptake of rooftop solar, and that is compensating for Eskom's continued failure. So, I mean, as much as the electricity is on, we're grateful for it, but we're paying too much for it, and it's still not reliable. You have to take a step back and say that South Africa can be a nation that has energy wealth, that exports to our neighbors, that is a powerhouse in the literal sense of the word. We are able to generate here on the back of solar radiation, good transmission networks if we maintain them and invest in them, good distribution networks. We're able to get to every corner of South Africa electricity at a price that allows organizations to build on top of that. But energy itself can be an economic opportunity. We can export to our neighbors. And if we get that right, what that does is the input cost per kilowatt hour, or effectively what a business has to budget for them to manufacture their gadget or produce, or, our agri-sector is big and the cost there. It brings all of that down, and it gives the consumer of that electricity, be that an individual or the business, the certainty that it will be there tomorrow and next week and a year from now, and they don't need to invest capital. Imagine you're a farmer and you have to decide, should I buy 2 tractors or should I fit out all the storerooms with solar? Like, you can only often do one of the two. You can't do both. And so your production slows down because you have to now invest in energy because the state has failed to provide it. So the DA has a comprehensive section in our 6-point plan that deals with how do we become a nation that has energy wealth. But if you wanted to understand it at the individual level in South Africa, you will be able to know that the electricity is going to be there. You'll know that it'll get cheaper over time and not more expensive. And you'll also know that because it's there, more economic opportunity will be at your disposal, because the people that might employ you have the certainty now that they can invest in the infrastructure that would employ you, as opposed to investing in the infrastructure that's needed to compensate for the state's failure.
So I'm not sure which one of you wants to take it, but can you give us sort of the top line action points? What do we want to do to fix it?
Well, I think the key point and the bold solution that we have for energy is what we call horizontal unbundling of Eskom, right? So that sounds quite technical and policy wonkish, but to basically put it in layman's terms, is we have had a state-owned entity in the form of Eskom that has controlled the vast majority of electricity generation, I think up to 86% of generation for the longest time. They have, over a long period of time, stopped the private sector from participating in the generation, transmission and distribution of electricity in the country. And there's been talk from the Minister of Electricity as well as the broader ANC that we must start creating a more competitive market for energy to make sure that it's more reliable and that it's more affordable. But their version of making a more competitive market is simply replacing a state monopoly with a private monopoly. And that's not going to introduce the kind of competition that we need to drive the prices down and to improve reliability. So what we are suggesting is to say you break up the generating capacity of Eskom into, let's say, for example, 6 to 8 different generating units that operate and compete against one another in order to provide the best possible service to consumers. And through that natural competition, you will ultimately be able to drive the prices down, improve the quality of provision, and ultimately we can get towards a point where we have energy wealth, which we can then use as a resource to leverage an external trade. And that's the first thing which I think is important. The second thing is we need to review the pricing structure which NERSA uses in order to apply electricity tariffs. For year on year on year on year, we have had above inflation increases on electricity prices, and despite the provision being very, very unreliable, these prices have continued to climb because they've had to bail out Eskom at the expense of the taxpayer. And it's important that we review that model to make sure that the increase in electricity prices is more closely aligned with the inflation rate so that we don't end up overpaying for electricity. Because we did start off in a position, particularly in the late 90s and the early 2000s, where we had an energy surplus. We were able to put together, deals with certain companies in South Africa to give them cheap, reliable electricity that allowed them to come and invest here. But we are now in a position where we face deep and insecure energy supply, and it's important for us to make those structural changes to affect the person on the street.
Well, one of the other points on the 6-point plan is related to the ports. Yeah?
Don't even get me started on how inefficient our ports
Note
are.
how I just stopped there. It's related to the ports.
Maybe I'll start with what's happening at the moment on the ground.
Yeah.
South African companies that are in the fortunate position to still have external clients while the ANC seems hell-bent on destroying our trading relationships. The ones that do still have foreign clients are taking their produce, putting it on the back of a truck, shipping it to the border with Mozambique, then paying for a convoy because Mozambique, unfortunately, is a nation in conflict. They then, once the convoy gets to the port in Mozambique, load it onto a ship there and ship it to foreign markets. And that port is a privately run port in Mozambique by a South African company called Grindrod. What I've just described to you is madness. That, by the way, is also a shallow port. So it's rate limited in the amount of volume that can go through that port. And we're sitting on what could be world-class ports in South Africa. And so the clear solution is to devolve and, where appropriate, privatize the operations of these ports so that they become more efficient. I mean, the city of Cape Town has been asking for this for years. We need these ports to be devolved. And then, of course, we need a rail network that services these ports. And the rail network needs to be both the trains, which there's some progress there, albeit very slow, that private operators should be able to compete with the absolute enormous entity that is Transnet. But also the rail network and the signaling, all of it needs to allow for private competition and the efficiency that the private sector introduces. Now, I want to stop there, and I know that when the DA says we need to privatize, alarm bells go off for people. Mm-hmm. But there are appropriate ways in which you could have private participants be a role player, even while the state over a long amount of time still owns the assets. So if you said, look, for whatever reason, I have an emotional attachment to the state owning the port in Cape Town, even though there are examples in other countries, such as the Netherlands, where there are privately owned and run ports, you could say, well, the state can still own it, but can we please concession it for 15 or 20 or 25 years so that a private participant knows that when they deploy capital to put the infrastructure that allows us to compete with the likes of China at our ports, that won't go away in 5 years because the contract gets awarded to Akeda in 5 years from now. You need the certainty of tenure for you to make the investment needed for our ports to run at the level they needed so that we're not relying on Mozambique for our exports. It's absolutely wild.
So, Mark, can I just
Told you not to get me started.
Well, it had to go there because actually I had, as one of my questions, first thing I thought about was the arguments and opposition to privatization. Now, I like that you came in with the concession model. We don't have to give them away or sell our ports. My question is, does our plan take a position on whether we want concessions, where the state still owns the ports, or whether we want full privatization? What are we arguing here? Because if we go full privatization, there's going to be a noise.
And sorry, can I just add to that, Matt? Also, just to also explain why is this part of the 6-point? I mean, if I'm living in Johannesburg, I suppose I'm just like, okay, there's no ports around me, but just to also understand what is the potential, or the impact for the ordinary South African when we talk about ports and the rail as well.
Sure. So firstly, it's a concessioning model, right? And we take the approach of concessioning ports, rail as well, and focusing on getting that right first, right? And if that model proves to be efficient, then we can retain that model, right? And then we can reassess the situation once we've allowed that model to be implemented. And I think that's the approach which the DA wants to take. And whilst we appreciate certain gestures by Minister Creasy, for example, who's put out RFIs and RFQs, particularly for private participation in freight rail, we don't believe that it goes far enough. And fundamentally, we think that there needs to be investment in the actual infrastructure itself, that being the railway tracks, and the ANC are not willing to allow private sector to get involved in the provision of, or shall I say, participation in private rail. So they could still have a part ownership of that particular railway network, but when we sit with the resource gap that we do as a country, you need the private sector to invest, because you're never going to be able to close that spending gap. So that's the first point that I think is important. Secondly, particularly energy, ports, rail, are structural economic factors that need to be resolved in order for you to be able to grow your economy. It's estimated that just by resolving those two issues, at this point in time, and I think the Bureau for Economic Research, which is based out of Stellenbosch, says that we can get to 2.5% growth. And I think, considering our discussion earlier, that's sort of the realistic number that we want to head towards. But fundamentally, what it means for a business is that you are able to export your good to another market, and you don't have to worry that the railway track has been stolen, or that the particular locomotive or the carriage which is supposed to take your good to the port is going to end up being defective and not going to run on time and going to cost you above what it should actually cost you. And you being able to then get that to the port and make sure that you are able to deliver it on time to the international market that is supposed to be the destination for your good. Because what we often find is weeks on end where there are hold-ups, whether that be at Cape Town Port or our major port of Durban, because the operational model is so slow at those ports. And that's because Transnet doesn't want to relinquish the power to allow private sector operators who internationally are able to do this and run some of the most efficient ports in the country, in the world, but because of the ANC's reluctance not to get the private sector involved, we now sit in a situation where you can't export your goods, land them in international markets, and ultimately generate revenue for your business and for the country.
Kabelo, I know you want to come in with a question.
Yes.
But well, go ahead, but I'd love to add something
because
there.
I want us to break it down
Sure.
further, so I'm not moving somewhere else. But my real question is, why? Why the reluctance to bring in the private sector? And I'll tell you why I'm asking. If you look at load shedding, for example, load shedding started in 2007. It took until 2021 for the president to finally increase the self-generation capacity.
Yes.
And only, I think it was last year, we were working on the Electricity Regulation Amendment Bill. We cannot move at a pace of problem solutions 15 years later. Like you say, when it comes to the railways, we don't have the money. If we keep going the ANC's way, we're eventually going to fix this in 15 years' time. What on earth is the objection to letting the private sector that can do things now come in? I'm genuinely confused.
Go on.
I want to just use one example because I think it's quite a stark example, right? And we're going towards a local government election here. But, you know, this just shows you why you need to get the private sector involved, right? So the city of Johannesburg has a 200 billion rand network infrastructure backlog, right? So that's water, roads, electricity, all right? 200 billion rand, okay? We were fighting over a VAT hike earlier this year to try and close a gap of like 30 billion rand because the national state did not have enough money to cover its needs.
Yeah.
Now we need to go and fund 200 billion rand, and you're telling me that a city like the city of Johannesburg, which this is probably double the size of its overall budget, needs to then invest the economy. The only way you can do it is by getting the private sector involved.
Now, to bring that back to Luyolo's question of how does this affect the guy sitting in Joburg going like, well, whatever you guys do with the ports, I don't see any near me. There's also the inward component here, which is if a South African producer, be that a farmer or somebody else, needs constituent parts for him to, and he needs his class tractor, you know. it doesn't land in time. The parts don't land in time. So everything is slowed down. And the guy sitting in Joburg, one doesn't have the diversity of, but things are just more expensive because everything is a bit slower. You ask a really interesting question, Kabelo. It's like, why is the ANC hesitant? And I think it's almost two answers. My answer 10 years ago would have been like, it's ideological. They believe in a central state. They themselves all trained, most of them trained under a command and control ideology in the, at the time, Soviet Union, which of course collapsed under its own weight because a state can never more efficiently determine what the population needs than the population can determine that. But that ideology, I would have said 10 years ago, still informed them. My now more cynical answer is because they're benefiting from this corrupt system. I mean, there's almost a direct line at the moment between the increased or proposed increases in taxes and these dodgy contracts getting awarded by PRASA and Transnet to do things that either aren't getting done or when they're getting done, they're not needed. PRASA, which is the passenger rail agency, did a ghost employee audit and it turns out 10% of their workforce doesn't exist. Transnet invested in the refurbing of old train locomotives that's all sitting gathering dust and rust in Joburg. And the only way to explain that is corruption. It's extraction. It's these patronage networks. And so, of course, when you introduce competition and you break the monopoly, just a quick step back on what does Transnet represent? It is unique in the world in that it controls the entire rail network. It controls who sits on top of that rail network. It controls how things move on that rail network and then feeds the ports, which it also controls. And on top of that, any pipelines, such as the oil pipeline running through our country, is also controlled by Transnet. It is a behemoth entity. And then I want to come back again to your buddy in Joburg, Luyolo, who's looking... The fact is we've just, the South African National Treasury has just underwritten another 99 billion rand guarantee, Transnet. What does it mean when the state underwrites a guarantee? It says, you guys can go take out bank loans as Transnet to fund these dodgy contracts. And when you're not able to pay back those bank loans, the South African taxpayer will bail you out. It's a different name, effectively, for a bailout, or a bailout by subterfuge, if you will, which will increase the amount of tax South Africans have to pay, be that income tax, corporate tax, value-added tax. We need to, as South Africans, be outraged at the level of inefficiency that Transnet is costing, both in terms of its fiscal cost, which I've now described in the form of these guarantees, and many other fiscal costs, as well as its economic cost. The lost opportunity, there are some academics indicating 200 to 300 billion rand is being lost out every year as a result of the way that Transnet operates now. So it does matter. It does affect us. It makes our lives more expensive and less fun.
Yeah.
Mark, I'm glad that you're speaking about that, because that is the fourth point of the 6-point plan presented by Johnston Hazen, which is to cut wasteful expenditure as it pertains to state-owned entities. And I think, both you and Matt have been outlining various different state-owned entities that continue essentially taking money out of South Africans' pockets. But what is the plan when we say, or when the DA says in the fourth point, we want to increase growth by stopping wasteful expenditure? We essentially saying, how are we going to do it? How are we going to do that?
Yep. So this was our big contention during the budget battle, is to say that there's so many data points to try and relay, but I've tried to explain to people in the following way, that if you take the current 2025 budget that's now been passed, and you compare that to the 1995 budget at Nelson Mandela's disposal, in economics, we do what's called inflation adjusting. So you take that 95 money and you make it 2025 money, so you can compare them with each other. This budget is 3 times bigger than that budget was. And if you do the same thing for some of the Mphithi budgets, this budget is twice as big as the Mphithi budgets were. And those had social grants baked into them. And both Mbekki's budgets and Mandela's budgets, if you spoke to people, I think in 1995 and then, 10 years on versus now, they feel like those governments did way more for them than this government is able to do for them.
We're not getting like 3 times or twice as much from government.
No, way less. We're not getting even the same amount. We're getting a fraction of what we used to. Okay, so there's clearly something wrong in the way that we're
being taken.
Yeah, exactly. So something's wrong in the way that we're spending. Now, other countries such as the UK have baked into their annual fiscal process what's called a spending review. So they look at departments spun up when politicians showed up to take pictures with babies and cut ribbons, and they say, do we still need this? What benefits are we getting from that photo opportunity 4 years ago? That doesn't exist in South Africa. Treasury makes a token effort every now and again to do within departments some reviews of some items of expenditure, but there's not serious questions being asked like, why do we need overlapping departments that all focus, for example, on human rights when we've got a Human Rights Commission? And so you have to start asking yourself the question, what things have we spun up that we don't need anymore? And how many entities sit around with directors that earn multiple million rand salaries, and there are more directors in those entities than there are employees? It's not conceivable that the executive class is delivering to such an extent that they don't need employees. All that's happening is extraction. And so the question then becomes, how do you find out where these inefficiencies exist with a comprehensive spending review? But more importantly, and the almost existential problem facing South Africa is, how do you exercise the political will once you've found these inefficiencies to get rid of them? How do you go after corruption? How do you make sure that the Zondo Commission recommendations are implemented? And I do think there I'm optimistic, but we need a change of who controls things, because at the moment it's just not happening.
But just to come in on what Mark says, he spoke about earlier exactly how much our state-owned entities have cost the South African taxpayer. And we look at how much debt consumes our overall national budget, right? I mean, it is astronomical, our debt to GDP ratio. It's something like 76%, headed closely towards 8% over the coming years. Because for too long, we've been bailing out all of these underperforming, corrupt state-owned entities. I think Eskom in itself, and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, has received something in excess of 300 billion rand over the last 15 years to bail it out. And ultimately, it's the South African taxpayer who has to pay for that particular bill, right? So when we look at the services that are provided on a frontline basis, so healthcare, education, policing, there's now less money for those services because we're busy paying for the debt that was incurred because CADA's got contracts, which just shows you what a vicious cycle it is. And this is why it's important that, number one, we end bailouts, and number two, that we fundamentally restructure these entities that operate in key segments of our economy to make sure that we can get the economy to grow.
Now, I want to dig a little bit into ghost workers. The first time I read this phrase, I genuinely could not figure out what it meant. Like, is there work being done, but no one knows who's doing it? It's
like a ghost ship.
Exactly. So, Mark, maybe can you talk to us about what are ghost workers? What do we know about what they've cost us already? And do we have any idea even of the full scope of the problem?
Can I give you a quick tangent on ghost ships? So for those who don't know and are interested, a ghost ship is a ship that doesn't have any personnel on it, and it's become unmoored somewhere, and it's just drifting in the ocean. And so every now and again, somewhere on a radar, a ghost ship shows up, and it's just out there. It's a creepy concept, isn't it?
I thought this was a Pirates of the Caribbean reference.
I also thought you were kidding with some mythical
Go Wikipedia ghost ships. Fascinating. Ghost workers, on the other hand, are individuals that are drawing a salary that don't exist. So imagine, and I can't speak to all of the examples of how people are going about their corruption, and I definitely don't want to give the audience ideas. But imagine there's an ID number that's somehow linked to somebody that may or may not exist, but let's, for the purpose of this explanation, say that the person does in fact exist. Either they've passed on, or they're not of a working age, or otherwise completely unaware that their name is being used. All the documentation is submitted for a job opportunity, and then through a bit of influence here and there, this person, let's call them Johan, is employed at a state-owned entity or is even employed in government departments. And we've described earlier that we've got this problem that there's a difference between what state employees earn and what they could earn in the market.
Yeah.
So these are often attractive salaries. Think of by April 2026, and I'm not saying Parliament has ghost workers, but parliamentary cleaners by April of next year will earn almost 30,000 Rand a month. So think of people earning attractive salaries, and Johan is now drawing a salary. And by the way, here's Johan's bank account details. And the way the South African banking system works is it gets paid to a number. So whatever name you put in there is not really as important. And people are trying to do some things about this fraud. But the name's not really as important as a bank account number. So they're submitting a bank account number for Johan, but really it's some other guy that's probably already employed by the state. And now he's getting a 30,000 Rand annuity income for Johan's job at the state. Again, what I've just described to you is wild. And now imagine at an entity like PRASA, where this is a couple of thousand line entries, multiple Johans getting these salaries at the expense of the South African taxpayer. It was 10% of their workforce. This is a ludicrous number.
So what's scary about it is that that's one entity. That's why I'm asking, do we even have a way of estimating what the scope of this across government could be?
Well, what I can tell you is that we are spending on the public wage bill in this budget about 800 billion Rand. Now, PRASA had 10% of their workforce that didn't exist, but let's say 2% of 800 billion Rand was discovered as doesn't really exist.
Yeah,
That amount alone would be 16 billion Rand, which is more than we ended up fighting over in this VAT debate of 15 billion Rand. So what I'm saying to you is we don't know what the number is. We can't estimate how much dodginess is going on here. But even if it's just 2%, which is 5 times less than we've already discovered within one SOE, then it's a number that would mean that there would be no debate about where will the money come from and why do we need to tax South Africans more. And it's a number that we could then apply and use those funds to try and support South Africans to create opportunities for themselves. But I guess there's 2 ways of looking at what I've just said. The one is to get really depressed, and the other is to say there's so much money being left on the table. If we start finding these things, I think we're going to be quite excited about what we can do with those resources.
No, Mark, I think it's quite clear that we're coming for the ghosts. That's what we need to be doing right now. But Matt, I want to bring you into the 5th point of the 6-point plan, which is a very important point as well, because we're going into the local government elections, and we know that the state of municipalities across our country are really not in a good condition. I mean, I always go back, I'm from Joburg, so I go back to the city of Johannesburg completely falling apart. And I think many South Africans are very concerned because municipalities are the first line of contact with government. And so when we're seeing the disarray that's happening, we really do get concerned. And so in the 6-point plan, we talk about fixing municipalities. What do we mean, and how are we going to do that?
100%. I think, as we said, Joburg is a stark example of municipal collapse, total municipal collapse. I don't think Bree Street's been fixed despite it exploding almost 2 years ago. And that is just, the visual imagery of that is just too difficult to bear. I think the important thing that we argue for in the plan is to say we need to shift from having dysfunctional municipalities to delivering municipalities. People pay rates and taxes to the municipality, and they should rightfully receive services, but they don't receive services. We know that cities like Johannesburg, for example, go for weeks without water because there are too many leaks, and what they call non-revenue water exceeds sometimes beyond 50%. We know that electricity, despite there not being load shedding, is not reliable and not affordable because the electrical infrastructure is not fixed in the city by City Power, the municipal owned entity that's supposed to handle that. And most importantly, we've got political instability in a number of our major metros. And these major metros are our engines of growth, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to quote a certain hair product salesman from years past, but if Joburg works, the rest of South Africa works. It still remains our biggest city, our most economically strategic city, and it's important that we get a place like Johannesburg working by stabilizing the politics in that particular city. So how we as the DA propose to do that is, number one, by making sure that we argue for, and we've introduced this in private members' legislation, is a threshold of at least 2%, right? So you don't sit with all of these one-man bands and what Helen likes to call popcorn parties who are able to hold the gun to your head and dictate terms to you for either keeping your government in place or collapsing your government. And we've seen this in a place like Johannesburg, where there's been a revolving door of mayors, where I think we've had between 9 and 10 mayors just over the past 3 or 4 years. And that does not bode well for stable governance. So number one, it's about introducing that threshold. Number two, it's also about making sure that we focus on revenue which is generated by the municipality through trading services, so things like electricity and water, and reinvesting into that infrastructure by ring fencing it. So what the National Treasury would do is they would say to the municipality, you have generated X amount of revenue for your trading services, so water, refuse and the like, but you must spend a certain percentage on reinvesting back into that. Because what you will find, and there are a number of important social projects that take place in municipalities, but money is often diverted from critical infrastructure that's meant for service delivery to fund things like beadwork projects, right? Often at a large sum of money. And fundamentally, the first port of call for municipalities to make sure that the services that the Constitution says that they should provide as per Section 5B are the services that they provide. And that's why we believe those two measures specifically will turn dysfunctioning municipalities into delivering municipalities.
Yeah, and I think an important thing to remember is that, in a place like Johannesburg, where they've got, I think their budget is 80 billion. Am I making this up?
It's about 80.
Yeah. So theoretically, at least, you could get away with a bit of waste here and there.
One way of putting it.
I mean, you can get away with it. You shouldn't do it.
Sure.
But you could live. But you also have really, really small municipalities where every single rand counts. And if you look at places like Umgeni, if you look at places like Midvaal, and how the DA has been able to use minute resources to do really good things for the local population, I do think it's important for us to add that all these changes aren't just for the benefit of the big metros, right? It could literally transform small towns, small cities all around the country.
Most certainly. And I think another important point to add, and we cite places like Umgeni, like Midvaal, where we've got Chris Papas, as well as Mayor Peter Texera out in Midvaal. And they have small budgets, right, relative to these big metros, but they've got competent municipal servants that are there. They've got competent politicians who are there on the basis of their skills and are there not because they are politically connected, but because they are able to do the best in the jobs that they are asked to do. And that's fundamentally an important issue for us to address at a local government level, because you often find a number of these smaller municipalities across the country have the worst audit outcomes in the country. And that's because you have a municipal manager that sits with grade 10. How he even got the job in the first place, I mean, it's a relatively high-paying job. I mean, municipal managers earn anywhere from 2 million rand to 5 million rand a year. How the man got the job in the first place is only through ANC catered
like a ghost worker.
He's a ghost worker. He's there, but he's only half there.
Sure.
And shall we say, the glass is half full. But we find ourselves in a situation where you've got people who don't have the necessary skills in charge of, significant budgets, and ultimately what that means is a failure to deliver services to people. And that's why I think it's really important that we look at examples like Midvaal, we look at examples like Umgeni, where despite limited resources, when you have competent people in place, you are able to bring about the DA difference. And that's why I think it's important for voters to come out in next year's election so we can have more Midvaals and we can have more Umgenis.
Indeed.
Mark, I want to bring you to the last point of the 6-point plan, which I think is something that most South Africans are really always. I think it's, sometimes I just feel like we get so desensitized when it comes to corruption, because like every day is a new story. And so like when you hear something over and over, I'm sure there's a psychology about this, but when you hear something over and over, it just becomes so normalized in your mind that whether it's 500 million or whether it's 1 billion, it just all sounds the same at the end. But I don't think we should ever be desensitized to corruption, because that will really, really eat up our democracy bit by bit until we have nothing left. But on the last point of the 6-point plan, we talk about anti-corruption measures as a form in which we start to then turbocharge our economy and our country.
Yeah. I think a lot about what gets an economy going. And one of the most compelling maxims I've heard as it relates to crime and corruption says that you don't have crime because your economy isn't growing. Your economy isn't growing because you have crime. And in South Africa, whether by neglect or direct exploitation, we have completely hollowed out. I say completely, I think, as Ian Cameron would often say, there are good men and women in blue. But to a large extent, and especially at the upper echelons, we have hollowed out our capacity to arrest crime, to prosecute crime. and I'm sure, Kabelo, you could talk about how we deal with people then that have been found guilty in the minority of cases of crime. All of this capacity has been eroded over time. And so if we're serious about growing the economy, creating jobs, I think we need to get it right that we go after, and I think especially white-collar crime seems pernicious to me, and I'm not excluding the private sector from that. In fact, one of the reasons I came into public service is because I was so hurtful of us in South Africa pretending that the private sector isn't complicit in a lot of the crime happening, the corruption happening. But we need to go after these people, whether they're in the state or in the private sector, and we need to put some head on pikes and make examples. And so, this part of the policy speaks to how we're going to do that. There's no good reason that the Scorpions should have been disbanded. We all know why the Scorpions were disbanded. And so we need to and there are interesting examples. I have had the privilege of traveling extensively, and it's definitely not in all regards a country that you'd want to model after, but Italy has a sort of detective-led prosecution model. I'm not advocating for that policy, but what I am advocating for is a closer collaboration between our crime enforcement and our prosecution arms, and that is what the Scorpions offered us. And of course, we know now why we don't have that anymore. So I think if you get that right, you start creating this environment where the rocket ship can take off. I think there's also a psychological benefit for South Africans in that at the moment, a lot of us are living in fear of our lives and of our property. And it takes up a lot of headspace, and I think it has knock-on effects. I don't have empirical evidence, it's just my sense. It takes up a lot of headspace, and as a whole, I suspect makes us a bit less productive, because we're anxious, man. What if something's going to happen to myself or my family or my stuff? And I think that stuff carries into work, and I think it carries into a lot of things. So, yeah, this part of our policy suite proposal and our 6-point plan says that we need to arrest that if we're actually serious about getting the economy going. The one thing maybe Matt would want to add something, and I'll circle back to a story.
So we've had this discussion about GDP in different forms today, and I think we've explained to the listeners and the viewers exactly what GDP is, and we hope that the Economics 101 lesson has been well taken today. But the World Bank recently released a report which shows that the crime that we have in this country, particularly violent crime, leads to a 10% decrease in GDP per annum. That means it takes away 10% of our economy, the crime situation that we have in South Africa. And I think that is a dire statistic. And I think, as Mark correctly put, you need to make sure that you've got the sort of fundamental building blocks in place for people to want to invest, to expand their business operations, and know that they are not going to constantly be the victim of either extortion or of violent crime. And that's really, really important. You want tourists to come to your country, you need to make sure that when they arrive at an airport, there's not some syndicate of criminals waiting outside to shoot them down or to kidnap them and try and take them hostage. And you want to focus on making sure that with having those fundamental building blocks in place, the key arms of the state are actually able to operate, right? So you need a professional policing service. You can't have cadre deployment within the policing service and have a policing service that is captured by political elements. We recently saw Lieutenant General Mkhwanazi, the KZN Police Commissioner's public address, where he made a number of very serious allegations against political capture, which led to dear Minister Senzo Mchunu being put on the bench. And this just shows you how the police, which are supposed to protect South Africans and serve South Africans, have become captured by political interest. And we need to remove the politics out of policing, because ultimately their job should be to go after the powerful people and protect those who are powerless. And that's fundamentally what we are trying to achieve in arresting the crime pandemic.
What I love about what you said is just making the direct link between crime and corruption is not a separate thing from GDP. It actually has a direct sort of draining effect. Now, I'm on correctional services, and one of the things we know about imprisonment is that the fear of getting a big sentence is not an effective deterrent, but the certainty that you will be prosecuted is a good deterrent when people are thinking about corruption. Now, this week on 702, there was a bit of a heated discussion because one of the hosts was feeling sorry for Nosiviwe Kgobisa-Ngcaba in the dock.
When she was crying crocodile tears.
And he was just so heartbroken for her. And it was so encouraging that lots and lots of South Africans came and said, no, she deserves to be there and she earned it. And I just think it's so important that the DA has, as part of an economic plan, a plan to address this insidious thing that it sucks out. We think of our safety, but we don't think of our pockets and how corruption actually directly impacts us in that way. So I love that we have this in our economic plan.
But I mean, just one further example, right? So we've seen the sort of mushrooming of the construction mafia, right? These criminal syndicates that go around thinking because either they've got political allegiance or they are just outright criminals, that they can go and demand 30% of a particular contract, or they can demand 30% of a business. Like, this is mafia state stuff, right? But this happens to people and business owners across South Africa, right? We need to make sure that we focus on rooting out that extortion so that we are not taking money out of businesses that are trying to expand and create jobs to uplift South Africans out of poverty. Because each of these has a vicious cycle. And that's why it's so important that we deal with those root causes. And fundamentally, this all comes down to the rule of law. No economy grows unless you have the rule of law in place and you make sure that the institutions that are supposed to protect the rule of law are properly equipped and fit for purpose.
Mark, let's circle back to you. I'm really interested in the story that you wanted to share. I don't want it to be a ghost story, so we need to tell it, right? So
perhaps I'll hold on to it for next time.
For next time? Yeah. All right, awesome. Well, guys, we've spoken about the 6-point plan, and I wanted to put you guys on the spot. And ask you guys to just quickly summarize from your understanding or to the listener what the DA is actually trying to do with the 6-point plan to boost the economy. Just for you to just give us a concrete thing, because I think we've unpacked these very important issues and we know what the problems are, and we putting the suggestions and solutions of the day. But just briefly, 6-point plan means what?
Okay, on the spot again. I thought we'd been on the spot the whole time. I thought I should come in here with a cheat sheet because I was worried about the questions you guys were going to ask me. But I think fundamentally it means the following, right? Is that we need to remove the harmful policies that stop people from getting jobs and growing the economy. We need to make sure that we have cheap and reliable electricity. We need to make sure that when we produce something, we're able to get it on a train to the port and into another market. We need to make sure that we focus on spending public money on services and on infrastructure which people need in order to be able to grow the economy and create jobs. We need to make sure that when we pay our municipal rates and taxes to the municipality, that they deliver us the services that we expect. And lastly, we need to make sure that when we walk around in our communities and our neighborhoods, when we run businesses, that we are not at threat of being targeted by violent criminals or extortion rackets on a continuous basis. And simply put, that is what the turbocharge plan aims to do. Practical steps which are within our grasp in order to be able to grow the economy, create jobs, and ultimately move from this holding pattern that we've been in over the last 15 or so years towards a more prosperous future, a more equal future, and a future that is prosperous not just for a select group of individuals, but for all South Africans.
Mark, before you answer, just a different spin on what Matt has said. What's the heart behind this?
Yeah, I'm glad you're asking it in that way, because I was thinking of telling you a story of what a Ghanaian man once said to me. And I was working in management consulting, and we were advising a group of multilateral funders, and we traveled out to that part of the world. And so we're in West Africa, and we've taken a bunch of meetings, and we're really on the way back to the airport. And finally somebody gets back to us. He says, "I can see you now if you're able to come see me." And it's 20 kilometers outside of Accra and peak traffic, and there we are. By the way, the roads there aren't the roads that we know. We've got so much going for us in South Africa. And so we're sitting in the traffic, and we're on the way to this guy, and none of us really have the appetite to have one more interview about the impact investing landscape out there. And we get to this guy's office, modest 3-story building, and as we step into this office, he's got pictures of him meeting Bill Clinton, Prince Charles, and I'm just like, "Whoa, what is your story? How did we get here?" And this guy had a decade prior started with clay cook stoves, and he'd figured out that this clay cook stove that he has can be twice as efficient as the way people are cooking at the moment. People live so hand-to-mouth, or were at the time living so hand-to-mouth out there, that they would literally use a portion of their daily earnings to buy coal to go make their food, and tomorrow they do it again. So he said to them, "You're going to use literally half the coal you used to use. And what I want you to do is every second day, with your clay cook stove, I'm giving you a little piggy bank. And every second day, you're going to take the savings and put it in there. And in 6 weeks, I'll be back. I'll take the piggy bank, and you keep the cook stove." And so his business started in that way. And now, at the time, he was the biggest renewable energy provider in 3 West African countries. He's doing solar. But he started with that, the innovation that. And the thing he said to me is this. He said, "Mark, what I had to teach my partners in each of these countries, my distribution partners and my sales partners, is that for them to own a percentage of something, be that 20 or 50%, something that's viable, something that's got legs, is so much more valuable than the ego value of owning 100% of nothing." And this is the key concept in everything we've proposed here. Is the state, up to date, before we got into this government, insisted that it needs to own and control everything. But that leads to inefficiency, and it leads to corruption, and it leads to cadres looting while the rest of us are suffering. And actually what we want is for South Africans to start owning a portion of this. And the state can still have a stake in something, but they'll have a stake in something, not 100% of nothing.
That is an amazing and profound story, Mark. Thank you for sharing that. So we've gotten your TikTok summary of the plan. Now, I am the podcast's resident cynic, or maybe pessimist. Close us off on a happy note. Give us hope. What happens if this plan gets implemented? What do we see for South Africa 2, 3, 5 years into the implementation of this plan?
Well, I think that political change is within our grasp. If we look at publicly available polling, the DA is on the upward trajectory, the ANC are on the downward trajectory. And if voters want to see this plan brought to life in their municipality, then it's important for them to make sure that they go out, register to vote, and vote for the DA in the upcoming local government election. Imagine what we could do if we had the majority in places like Ekurhuleni, Johannesburg, eThekwini, and the kind of change that we would be able to bring because we have the DA difference. Just imagine what we could achieve if we were able to do that. And that's really my call to South Africans, and in particular young South Africans, is to go out and be part of the process. If you sit at home on your hands, on your couch, and you criticize, but you don't get to roll up your sleeves and get involved, then things are not going to change. It requires each and every one of us to put our skin in the game and make sure that we build the kind of future that we all want as South Africans.
I propose that we take you guys out of Parliament, put you on a tour bus around the country, and you can be our door-to-door messengers. Tell everybody about the Turbo Plan.
Well, I just want to say thank you guys. Mathew Cuthbert, the DA Head of Policy for the Democratic Alliance, Dr. Mark Burke, the Spokesperson of Finance in the National Assembly. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. And I think, with this plan, it's something interesting. And I think, when we listen to stories like that and we understand the heart behind it, because this is not just a piece of paper or information. There's a heart behind it, right? And the heart is for South Africans. A better life for all South Africans. That's what the fight is each and every day. And I know that's what the fight is for you guys. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.